Vamos a hablar ahora de algo muy concreto.
We will now speak about something very concrete. What happened in Venezuela? Using this concept of correlation of forces, we will see how it applies in a specific historical reality like Venezuela. What was the situation in Venezuela like when President Chavez won the elections in 1998? The world correlation of forces was very negative. Remember that the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet bloc disappears in the end of 1991. As a result, capitalist forces remain in a position of absolute dominance, and the United States became the primary world military power without any counter-correlation because the counterweight of the Soviet military didn't exist more. The threat of a nuclear war has disappeared, and the United States gained the capacity to act unilaterally because he had the most powerful military force in the planet. And with this disappearance of the Soviet socialist communist model, capitalism was threatened because now no one could convincingly argue that there was an alternative. And in this context emerged the thesis that neoliberalism represents the end of the history. That occurs on the international area. When Chavez began his process, he was alone in Latin America and facing these correlation of forces at the world level. But internally, what was happening? Internally, although Chavez won the election with more than 50% of the votes, that is to say with a great popular majority support, because he was seen as the alternative in a country that was immersed in a structural crisis, where the state was in crisis, where a national president has been removed for corruption, where the people were fed up with corruption, with patronage. Chavez's first thought was of carrying out an armed insurrection to achieve power and transform the country. But then, realizing that the people in general in Venezuela did not want violence, he decided to engage in the electoral struggle, the institutional struggle, and stand for elections and win the election. But what was the correlation of forces in that moment in Venezuela? He had the support of a large part of the army, but he had a minority in the National Assembly, and the same was true with regard to regional governors and mayors. The judicial power was in the hands of people who represent the previous ruling bloc. Similarly, the economy and the media were basically in hands of previous ruling sectors, and the level of organization of the popular movement and of Venezuelan political parties was very weak. We cannot compare, for example, the parties of the Chilean left with the parties of the Venezuelan left. The Chilean parties were larger and stronger, with great tradition of struggle, and the popular movement was also largely unorganized in Venezuela.
¿Qué hace Chávez frente a esta situación tan
What
negativa?
did Chavez do in face of such a negative situation both internationally and domestically? Internationally, the first thing he did was to try to change the correlation of forces, encouraging alternative organizations to those of imperialism. Among other things, he promoted Latin American Caribbean integration in different ways. For example, empowering Mercosur and creating ALBA, which is the Bolivarian Alliance of the America, a form of integration acting differently according to each country and with solidarity between these countries. The most concrete expression of this new form of integration was the one that existed between Cuba and Venezuela. Another measure was the preferential treaties he made with the poor countries of Central America and Caribbean, the sale of oil at prices much lower than those of the world market. He also strengthened ties with Cuba right from the beginning of the revolutionary process. He revitalize and strengthen the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which at that time has been greatly weakened, and he succeeded in getting one of his best cadres, Ali Rodriguez, to become the president of OPEC, and there was an important achievement, the establishment of fair oil prices for producing countries. In addition, he sought to create alliance, break the nearly absolute dependency that Venezuela had on the United States. So he established relations with India, Russia, China, and Iran. He established this multipolar relation fundamental for a country like ours to be sovereign. Also, he promoted international forums for emerging nations, the Forum of the 15, the Forum of South-South Cooperation, the Group of the 77, which brings together 120 underdeveloped nations. And in Latin America, we have advanced very much. We now arrive to have meetings of our countries without the presence of the United States. We are sovereign, and we are beginning to decide things without the presence of the United States.
Ahora, en cuanto a las fuerzas internas.
President Chavez understood that the first thing he has to do is to change the rules of the game of the institutional system, given the fact that he had decided to move a process of social transformation through the institutional way, through non-violent popular mobilization rather than a direct military challenge. He has known the limits of this path and therefore says that these limits, these rules of the game, had to be changed. And to do that, his first popular consultation was, do you want us to form a constitutional assembly to draft a new constitution? The people support the referendum. The constitutional assembly was convoked. The assembly drafted a new constitution, and the constitution was approved by a great majority of voters. And this constitution requires that new elections be held for elected officials at all levels of the state. And in those elections, the president and those who support him gain a great victory. They attain a comfortable majority in the National Assembly. They gain control of a significant majority of governorship and mayoral office. They convert the judiciary into an institution which was willing to uphold the Constitution rather than be managed by oligarchic groups. This was the situation following the Constituent Assembly after the general election. But before going on to speak about what happened next with this institution, we have to take into account that together with these wins, it was necessary to take stock of the fact that the social and political movements in Venezuela were very weak. The parties were not, as we say, sufficiently consolidated. The Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 200, which was the political group that supported him in the army, was composed of a reduced number of militants, and the Movement for a Fifth Republic, which was the electoral instrument created to win the election, was simply an electoral aircraft. So Chavez began to look for different initiatives to build popular and party-type organizations. He called for rebuilding the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 200. He promoted the Bolivarian circles, and after created the political commando of the revolution. That is to say, we see Chavez thinking of the necessity of a political instrument and the necessity for social organization. This is not the place to analyze how successful these initiatives were, but it gives us a good overview of Chavez as a political strategist and of his awareness of the necessity of changing the correlation of forces.